This week on Star Trek Sundays, I'll be taking another look at some of the more recent Star Trek Mego releases. As I mentioned in my last video, we've had something of a deluge when it comes to Star Trek Megos over the last few weeks, and I'm particularly excited to get started today and look at Kor the Klingon and the motion picture Mr. Spock. Now, both of these figures are marked as European exclusive releases. They are essentially variants of figures that were released exclusively as part of their Topps deal in the US in 2021. And you'll probably notice by the sticker on the packaging that these are European exclusives, and they seem to be limited to just 1,000 units each. But for anyone who's curious as to what the Topps exclusive version looked like of the Mr. Spock figure, here is Mr. Spock in his Starfleet uniform from the motion picture. This looks like a really tremendous figure. Of course, the figure itself is exactly the same, it's the costume that is completely different, and you'll notice he also comes with his phaser as well, which looks really nice, and if I'm able to get my hands on this, I will do, and I'll do a video on him at another date. But for now, let's take a closer look at this variant of Spock from the motion picture, and I think this is definitely a worthwhile variant to pick up. This is Spock in his Vulcan robes from the beginning of the film, and I think it's quite an interesting visual look and design, and it feels a lot more Vulcan, a lot more alien than we're used to seeing Spock in, which I think is a really nice approach, and gives him that distinctive alien feel, which is fantastic. So I'm really pleased that we have this variant, and I think it's a really nice figure. But if we start off by looking at the packaging, again, you know what to expect at this point if you've ever collected any of the recent Mego Star Trek figures. It's pretty bland, there's not really enough here to make it feel individual or unique to the character, and we just have that United Federation of Planets logo in the background there, and of course we have the yellow strip and the image of Captain Kirk at the top to signify that this is related to the original series. As I said, for me, it's a little bit bland. I think there's a little bit more they could do to jazz this up and make it feel a bit more distinctive. But the reverse of the card is much better. Obviously, we have a film still here taken from the film of Spock in his robes. I think this looks really nice. I do really like this approach. It takes up the majority of the packaging as well, so it makes it quite fun to display, and I think it looks pretty good. The only thing I would say about this particular image is that they clearly have taken a film still, so it does look a little rough, a little blurry around the edges when it's been enlarged to this size, but hey, I'll take it. That one thing I should point out is that Spock does benefit from the new body mould that is being used on these new releases, as we saw last week in the DS9 figures, so he does have the added articulation, and it works very well for this figure. Overall, the presentation of this figure is really nice. For starters, I really like this head sculpt. I do believe they have recycled it from the Wrath of Khan version of this character, but I've always really liked this head sculpt. It's an older version of Spock than we're used to seeing, and I think they've caught some of the likeness and details in there quite nicely, actually, considering that this is an 8-inch figure, and of course they have a simplistic approach to their moulds, generally speaking, and I think they've done a quite nice job here. And likewise, in terms of the costume as well, I think they've done a really good job of capturing how this looks, again, despite the style and scale of Mego. One of the things I always like to point out is the ears. I think this is so crucial and important for Spock. On this head sculpt in particular, I think they've done a great job of getting the size and dimensions just right on those pointed ears. If we compare and contrast this against the ears that we see on the original series Spock, they're always, from my point of view, too long and too narrow, and it just doesn't look quite right. So I think they've done a really good job here. One of the things that really impressed me was the fact that they've got those sleeves nice and long and chunky, and it looks just right the way it should do, which is great. Difficult to tell at the in-package photos because his arms are down by his side, and it did look like it was just basically sleeves and the tunic, but I think they've actually done this really proud. I think this looks fantastic. The great thing, of course, is that this does open up, and underneath he has a grey sort of vest there, which again creates that sense of level of depth and texture, which is really nice to have a couple of layers to the costume. For his hands, he is given the brand new moulded hands, so this is the first time we've seen this on a Spock figure. So these are more lifelike, I suppose, in terms of how they're able to grip and how the fingers are poised, which is great. The only criticism I have is that I'm disappointed we didn't get a Vulcan salute hand. That would have been really cool. Perhaps it could have been a swappable piece, for example, but hey, beggars can't be choosers. Now, his trousers and boots will be very familiar to anyone who's collected any of the original series Star Trek crew figures, because these, of course, have just been recycled. Both figures have the exact same articulation, so I'll run through just the ones here with Spock, and as I mentioned, there is new and improved articulation with this wave of Mego releases. So for a start, he does have the swivel at the neck, of course, so he can spin his head 360 degrees, but then he has actual ball joints in the shoulders, which means he can lift his arms up and out, which is fantastic. There's a pin swivel at the elbow, meaning he can swivel his lower arm around, he can bend it to 90 degrees, and then there's another pin swivel at the wrist. So again, that wrist can rotate all the way around and it'll hinge forwards and backwards. There's the standard ball joint in the waist, of course, meaning he can spin from side to side, look up and down, and lean left to right. Meanwhile, there is a hinge at the hips, meaning the legs can kick out to the side, they can kick forwards and backwards, and then there is another pin swivel at the knee. So again, that lower leg can bend from side to side, and it will hinge to 90 degrees. Sadly, there's no accessories for this figure, but I think he's pretty complete as is. I think this is a really nice addition to the line. As I said, not too many surprises here when it comes to the head sculpt. We have seen this before, but I think it's a really good one and a very welcome return. I really like the new articulation. I think that's absolutely fantastic, and I think they've done a really good job of his costume, particularly the tunic and the way that those sleeves fold out there. I think it looks really, really good, and as I said, a very welcome addition to the line. Next up, we have Kor. And waiting for the new Klingon release from the Mego line is like waiting for a bus. You seem to get nothing for ages and ages, and then suddenly you get two almost simultaneously, because this year, of course, we had the Kang release, and now we have Kor as well. And I have to say, in my opinion, the Kor is a step up. It is a quantum leap forward when it comes to the presentation of the classic Klingon. Now, in terms of the packaging, of course, it is very, very similar to what we've just seen with the Spock figure. There's nothing really to differentiate them except the figure itself. But the reverse, once again, has used a production still of the character, which I think looks really good. I really like this approach. It feels very authentic, of course, and it's nice to put on display. And in terms of the presentation, I feel like Mego have absolutely nailed it this time around, and overall there's a real feel of an uptick in quality with this release. I think they've done a particularly good job with the head sculpt. I think they've done a really good job of capturing the likeness of the actor. There's lots of little details here, and I think the paint apps they've used, although quite simple, there's not a lot going on here, definitely has caught what we see on screen. I think they've done a tremendous job. This head sculpt in particular is very, very good, and I really, really like what they've done here. It looks very authentic. One of the best things about the recent Klingon releases is the accuracy and attention to detail in the costume. This really looks authentically like what we see on screen, which is fantastic. I already really liked the Kang release, but I had some issues to do with the sash. It always felt a little bit too loose and a little bit too thin material. It is the same sash here, it is the same material, but what's really nice about the Kor release is that he has this wonderful plastic insignia sewn in, which I think looks really, really good, and again just gives it an extra bit of texture, a bit more realism, a bit more depth, and it works an absolute treat. If we look at Kang and Kor side by side, we can see how this is essentially the same outfit, but it's just been tweaked ever so slightly in some key places. On the belt, for example, yes, Kang had that gold patch there to represent the buckle, but here with Kor we can see the individual buttons that are placed on it, which looks really good, and again just takes this a notch above. I already mentioned the sash, but you can clearly see here that Kor's is closer to his body. It's a bit tighter, it's a little bit more formatted, which is fantastic, whereas Kang's is a little looser and a little less detailed. But also the neckline on the vest is a little bit more rectangular and less rounded this time around, which is great to see. The boots also seem to be pretty much the same as what we saw on the Kang figure, but these seem to be a bit firmer in my opinion, seems to be a bit more solid, which is nice, and he's able to stand freely without much incident falling over, which is great. For accessories, he comes with his Klingon Disruptor, which we've seen many times before. This isn't anything new, but again, it's nicely moulded and nicely painted, and it's a very welcome addition to have. And the real benefit this time around is that he's able to hold it perfectly, because of course he has that new hand sculpt, and as you can see, this works beautifully. This fits into his grasp really comfortably, very snugly, and it looks great. It looks like he's properly firing his disruptor, which is brilliant. And I have to say, all of this combined just makes an absolutely fantastic figure. This is hands down my favourite Klingon so far for the Mego line. I just love everything about it. The increased articulation means you can put him in more dynamic poses. The fact that he's able to hold his phaser makes it look much more authentic and realistic, which is beautiful. And I just think what they've done with the costume, just those little tweaks and nips and tucks here and there, have just really elevated it to something special. I think they've done a great job with this figure. And honestly, for me, both of these figures are absolutely fantastic. What a fantastic pair of releases. If you like the original series and if you like the original motion pictures, then you're going to love these figures if you're a Mego collector, because I just think they have significantly raised the bar with these two. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.